Fort Collins Christian Church. It's great to be gathering online with you as we continue our study through the Gospel of John. Ever since we were in John chapter 13, the Gospel of John has been covering the final night that Jesus spent with his disciples before being arrested. We've seen him wash their feet. We've seen him speak comforting words to them. We've seen him warn them about the hatred they're going to face for following him. We've seen him promise them the Holy Spirit. And then as we study just the last couple of weeks in John 17, we see Jesus pray for them. Now, as we head into chapter 18, we finally reach Jesus' arrest, his trial, and his execution, followed by his resurrection, and then him restoring the disciples who deserted him. These are the things we're going to be covering on the final 6 Sundays of 2020. While we're about to study what has become known as the hour of darkness, the overriding message that we'll be studying over the next 6 weeks is that there is hope in the darkness. Let's start by reading today's section of Scripture in its entirety. It's a pretty long section, so we're going to read it in its entirety before we break it down. John chapter 18, verses 1 through 27. It says, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it'd be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Those who are familiar with the story of Jesus' final hours before his death will notice that John's account is quite different than the accounts we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I've titled this morning's lesson, Jesus Flexes. And I titled it this way because commentators agree that what John uniquely omits and includes in his account versus the other accounts of Christ's passion actually emphasizes Christ's sovereignty and control over even his death. My wife, when I asked her to look at the lesson, said she doesn't really totally understand what flexing means. So I thought I should give a brief explanation in case you don't know. Flexing simply means a show of your strength. You could think of it in like flexing muscles, but people don't just flex muscles. They could flex their wealth. They could flex their intelligence. But see, Jesus doesn't flex the way the world does. Often when people flex, others end up laughing because they just seem arrogant or stupid or both. Oftentimes we overestimate ourselves. Even the people in this passage try to flex on Jesus with a show of strength in numbers and in weapons. Peter tries to flex by pulling out his sword. But Jesus' flexing is simply about who he is. And in who he is, that's where we find hope in the darkness. Let's look at a few areas we find Jesus flexing in this passage. The first one is in his surrender. Now, surrender might sound like a weird flex, but bear with me. We see at the very beginning of this section that one place John's account is different is that John tells us that Jesus and his disciples went to a garden where Jesus was ultimately arrested. And we know from the other Gospels that this garden was the Garden of Gethsemane, but John omits Jesus' agonizing prayer in the garden, where he asked repeatedly that, if possible, the cup of suffering on the cross could be taken away from him. But what John does include is Jesus' resolve to obey the Father's will when he commands Peter to put the sword away, saying, "Shall I not drink the cup which the Father has given me?" See, Jesus surrendered to the will of God, and this resulted in courageous obedience on his part. It takes courage to obey God in our lives. The life of following Jesus is an amazing life. I have zero regrets for the last 28 years in regards to surrendering to him as Lord of my life. And the promises of what lies ahead in eternity are so amazing that frankly they're hard to grasp. But let's be honest. If you also are living the Christian life, the life of following him, it is a difficult life at times. Obedience to God is often difficult. Surrender to his ways, when they seem to go so against our nature, that can be difficult. Did I mention that it can be difficult? Yet, it's in this very surrender to the fact that he is wiser, surrender to the fact that he is greater, surrender to the fact that he is perfect, that his ways bring hope and joy and peace. Is in that surrender that we can find the courage to obey him when it's difficult. This surrender for Jesus was Jesus's flex because it showed resolve and courage when faced with the difficult and daunting journey to the cross. He surrendered and fully obeyed the Father's will. The second area we see him flex here is in his omniscience. In verse 4, John omits Judas's betrayal kiss from the other accounts, but we're told that when Judas approached with the soldiers to arrest Jesus, we're told Jesus already knew all that was going to happen to him. So then he's the one who actually approaches them and says, who is it that you want? See, the knowledge that Jesus's flex was, it was not just a head knowledge. It was omniscience. He has a knowledge of all the past and all the future. Nothing is a surprise to Jesus. This highlights even more how courageous Jesus was in facing this crowd. See, Jesus knows the hearts of men and women. He knew Judas was betraying him. Imagine humans. Imagine you, me, having the foreknowledge of someone betraying us, what we would do with that. And this highlights even more how incredible his love must be, that he loved even Judas. But here we see the sovereignty of God in what happens, because it was God's plan for Jesus to die as the Passover lamb in order to redeem the world. Even the fact that these people were there to arrest Jesus during the Passover festival displays Jesus's omniscience. Consider this from Matthew's account. In Matthew 26, verses 1 through 5, it says, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. See, Jesus said that the Son of Man is going to be handed over to be crucified during the Passover festival. And yet Caiaphas and the other priests who were scheming to arrest him secretly and kill him, they say not during the festival. They were afraid a riot could happen. So if they didn't arrest Jesus during the Passover, then Jesus would have been wrong in what he said. Well, enter Judas. Judas might have had evil intent. They might have had evil intent. But under the sovereign rule of God, who has a purpose, let's look a little bit later in Matthew 26. Verses 14 through 16 say, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Okay, so Judas is looking for opportunity to hand Jesus over, and that opportunity came at a place that John says Jesus went to frequently and that Judas was well aware of. Where was that place? The Garden of Gethsemane. On Passover night, just like Jesus said. Jesus could have avoided the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing that Judas knew about it and knowing that Judas was going to betray him, but he didn't. He did this just the way God designed. Jesus flexed his omniscience and was in full control even of the details of when and where he would be arrested. And this gives us hope because we can know that he is sovereign even in the darkest of Satan's schemes if we just surrender to him and allow him to guide us. Thirdly here, he flexes his identity. John is the one who gives us the details of the interaction between Jesus and those who came to arrest him. In verse 3 of John 18, we're told that it was a detachment of soldiers that came with Judas. The word there means cohort. It could mean anywhere from 30 to a couple of hundred soldiers. So even if we take the low end of that, that is a lot of soldiers for one man. Plus, we're told there were members of the temple guard who were there, all led by Judas. There were most likely over 50 men involved here, and it says they brought weapons with them. Satan had planned his greatest coup. He had recruited the best of the Roman soldiers. He recruited armed Jews, and even one of the apostles. That was Satan's flex here in the garden. The Pharisees had tried to capture Jesus before, and Jesus had escaped. So they assured there would be no escape this time by the numbers of armed people they sent. That was their flex in the garden. But see, Jesus didn't intend to flee. He had sweat drops of blood praying about facing this and had surrendered his will to what God commanded. So what this posse of people with weapons flexing, what they encountered in the garden was no coward. They were introduced to a victor, to a conqueror who approaches them and says, "Who is it that you want?" And when they say Jesus of Nazareth, the English translations don't do this justice. They say that Jesus said, "Well, I am he." What he actually said was, "I am." Ego eimi were the two words in the original text there. Jesus says, "I am." That explains why they fell to the ground like dominoes. Jesus' response was the same phrase God used when Moses asked God what his name was. "I am." This is the same phrase Jesus said in John 8:58 when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." You're in search of Jesus? He says you have found God. Jesus flexed with his identity of being deity, and the best trained, most ruthless soldiers in the world, there to accomplish Satan's greatest plan, fall down like dominoes, because no one can stand when faced with the glory of who Jesus is. I mean, think about it. As people, we feel inferior when standing before human glory. I mean, we feel insecure if someone's smarter than us. We feel insecure if someone's more successful than us. We feel insecure if someone's better looking than us. Imagine standing before Jesus' glory. They might have thought they had the upper hand when they showed up at the garden, but make no mistake, Jesus was the one with the upper hand in this situation. Even as powerful as Satan can seem, he cannot stand before Jesus and his power and his glory. And that's not just in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's in your life, and that's in my life. I mean, if Jesus had the power and might over Satan's schemes before the cross, how much more in our lives today as the risen and glorified Christ? I don't know about you, but I can battle with feeling defeated at times and believing things like, "You know what, Mike, you're a failure. You are worthless." I believe things like, "You know what, Mike, you are never going to change." I believe things like, "Well, okay, God's promises are, they're awesome, but they're for other people, not for me." And yet Jesus possesses the ability to disempower Satan in our lives if we will just humble ourselves in reverence before him and place our identity in him. He is the Son of God, and he flexed his identity in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he still flexes it today in the lives of those who surrender to him as their Lord. The fourth area we see him flex is in his righteousness. Now let's go ahead and reread verses 19 through 23 of this section. It says, "Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. 'I've spoken openly to the world,' Jesus replied. 'I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said.' When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. 'Is this the way you answer the high priest?' he demanded. 'If I said something wrong,' Jesus replied, 'testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Jesus is the only person ever who could claim sinlessness. Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin," as that passage speaks about Jesus. And so we have hope in his righteousness because his coming to earth, living in the flesh, and facing the temptations that we face lets us know that he can empathize with our weaknesses. But we also have hope, not just in that he experienced temptation. We have hope in this because we serve a Lord who never sinned. We serve a Lord who is perfect in every way, who has literally never done anything evil. Also in this section in John 18, we see the failings that we as people have in standing even before our own standards. In this section, as the high priest is questioning Jesus, he was actually violating his own principles of Jewish justice. Jewish law at the time stated, our law does not inflict the penalty of death upon a sinner based on his own confession. So when Jesus says, "Why are you questioning me? Ask those who heard me," he, in a sense, is calling the high priest on the carpet for violating his own standards of justice by saying, by your own law, you don't have the right to condemn me by the methods that you're trying to condemn me. Why do I mention this little detail from this section? Because that is the same hopelessness we live in trying to be righteous on our own. Think about it. Out there, question for you. Do you think lying is wrong? My guess is almost everyone listening says, yes, I think lying's wrong. Okay, and yet haven't you lied? More often than you probably want to admit. I have. Another question. Do you believe it's wrong to talk bad about someone behind their back? Again, I think almost all of us would say yes, and yet don't you do it? Again, we probably do it more than we like to admit. Here's the third question. Do you believe it's wrong to lust after someone sexually who's not your spouse? Again, most of us probably say, yeah, that's wrong, and yet we struggle with it consistently. See, I say that because we can't even stand when judged by our own standards, much less if we are to be judged by God's standards. So what do we need? We need someone to intervene for us. We need someone to stand before God for us. Thus, our fifth and last point of looking at what Jesus flexes here, Jesus flexed with his sacrifice. We're told in this section in verse 8 that after Jesus got them to say that, hey, it's Jesus of Nazareth that we're looking for, Jesus then says, take me and let them go, speaking of the disciples. And in doing this, Jesus foreshadows what he was about to accomplish on the cross. Me for him, or me for her. That's what Jesus did. He says, I know they sinned, but take me as he goes to the cross. See, Jesus stands before the judgment and wrath of God for us, bearing our sins on the cross of death. Jesus was not a victim of circumstance here. He knew exactly what was going on, and he knew exactly the purpose that God had sent him to this very moment for. And he willingly stepped up and gave his life for us to be able to be reconciled to the God that we have rejected. He had said in John 10, no one takes my life from me. Rather, I lay it down willingly because I love my sheep. There was never a greater flex that affects our lives than this one. Jesus saying, me for him, or me for her. And in the garden, he even gives us a little sample of what this looks like. As we're told that Peter draws his sword and swings it and cuts off the ear of one of the high priest's servants, Jesus steps in and Jesus provides healing to that servant's ear. Incidentally, John's account doesn't tell us he healed the ear, but we know that from Luke's account. But something John does tell us that the other accounts do not is the name of that servant who was healed. He says, oh, by the way, that guy's name was Malchus. Why is that little detail important? Because by John disclosing his name, he provides the name of a witness to this amazing healing in which this miracle could be verified. That's a cool tidbit. He's saying, hey, someone could go, hey, you know what? John said, where's Malchus? John says that Peter cut your ear off and Jesus healed it. Is that true? And Malchus would be like, yeah, that happened. My ear was cut off and Jesus just healed it. Malchus is a witness to Jesus' mercy and compassion. The overall impression that John conveys through his narrative of the Passion of Christ is that Jesus was in complete control of his arrest and his crucifixion. Even though Judas betrayed him, even though armed soldiers came with weapons and succeeded in arresting him, which, by the way, they only succeeded in arresting him because he surrendered to God's will. Even though Peter, one of his closest friends, denies him 3 times. Even in all of that, Jesus was calmly in control of the events leading to his death. He was not a tragic victim. Rather, he was the good shepherd who willingly laid down his life for his sheep. Jesus flexed with his surrender to God's will. He flexed with his omniscience of the situation, with his identity as the Son of God, with his perfection, and ultimately with his sacrifice. And we can take hope from this in knowing that Jesus is Lord over every situation, even his arrest and his death. Please